The Terran diplomatic station hung in the void like a gleaming middle finger pointed at the universe, its polished chrome and glass architecture screaming, "Look how civilized we are," to anyone within a light-year radius. Orbiting the garden world of Kepler 442b, it had been humanity's first serious attempt at galactic diplomacy, which was roughly equivalent to a toddler announcing they were ready to perform brain surgery. The station's grand conference hall had witnessed more failed negotiations than a divorce lawyer's office, but today promised to be special. After 47 years of what the galactic community politely termed aggressive mineral rights disputes, and what everyone else called a bloody three-way war, the Vorthak Empire, Zephyrian Collective, and Nexari Federation had agreed to peace talks. The crystalline deposits of Zerion Prime had sparked this delightful conflict, deposits so rare they made platinum look like sidewalk chalk. The three species had been blasting each other into component atoms over mining rights for nearly half a century, turning entire star systems into debris fields that archaeologists would puzzle over for millennia. Naturally, when it came time to mediate, they chose humans. Not because humans were particularly wise, mind you. The galactic community had about as much faith in human diplomatic skills as they did in a Vorthok's table manners. No, they chose humans because humans were considered harmlessly neutral, like Switzerland with spaceships but half the intelligence. Ambassador Lydia Chen stood at the observation deck watching the alien vessels dock with all the enthusiasm of someone preparing for root canal surgery. The Vorthak dreadnought arrived first, a brutal wedge of metal that looked like it had been designed by someone who really hated aesthetics. Its hull bore scars from countless battles, each one probably considered a badge of honor by its crew. The Zephyrian ship followed, a perfect crystalline sphere that hummed with collective consciousness energy. It was beautiful, in the way that a spider's web was beautiful, just before it trapped you and slowly digested your hopes and dreams. Behind it came the Nexari vessel, golden and ostentatious enough to make a Las Vegas casino blush with shame. Ambassador Chen, her aide Marcus whispered, appearing at her elbow with the grace of a caffeinated ghost. They're requesting immediate audience. All three delegations arrived simultaneously, which their protocols suggest is either a good omen or a declaration of war. With our luck, probably both, Lydia muttered, straightening her diplomatic jacket. At 42, she had the distinction of being humanity's youngest ever galactic ambassador, which was rather like being the world's tallest dwarf. Her predecessor had retired after the infamous Rigel incident, when he accidentally started an interstellar trade war by mispronouncing the Nexari word for peace, and instead declared that their mothers were promiscuous space whales. The Grand Conference Chamber was a masterpiece of neutral design, featuring a circular table that could accommodate beings of radically different physiologies. The lighting was carefully calibrated to avoid triggering any species' territorial responses, though Lydia suspected it made everyone look slightly nauseous, which seemed appropriate for peace talks. Supreme Commander Krixtal of the Vorthak Empire entered first, because Vorthak always entered first, even if it meant knocking down walls. Standing 8 feet tall with chitinous armor that looked like it had been forged in the heart of a dying star, Krixtal had the pleasant demeanor of a rabid honey badger with abandonment issues. His species believed that showing weakness was punishable by immediate exile, which explained why Vorthak family reunions typically ended in bloodshed. "Human Chin," he growled in accented standard, managing to make her title sound like an insult. "I trust your species has prepared adequate seating for real warriors?" Before Lydia could respond, Hive Speaker Velthara materialized from her transport pod, her form shifting between solid and energy states like a very sophisticated ghost with commitment issues. The Zephyrians were a collective consciousness, meaning Velthara was technically thousands of individuals pretending to be one person, which seemed like the universe's most elaborate anxiety disorder. "Greetings, individual human Lydia Chen," Velthara intoned, her voice harmonizing with itself in ways that made Lydia's teeth itch. "We, who are many, acknowledge your species' attempt at mediation, though we calculate only a 12.7% probability of successful resolution." "How wonderfully optimistic," Lydia said dryly. Trade Prince Zolkar swept into the chamber last, because Nexari believed that punctuality was for species too poor to make others wait. His golden robes probably cost more than most planets' GDP, and his retinue of advisors followed him like very expensive, very nervous ducklings. The Nexari had turned capitalism into an art form, which was impressive considering they'd managed to patent the concept of oxygen in 17 different star systems. Ambassador Chen, Zolkar purred, his forearms gesturing expansively. I trust the profits from this endeavor will be mutually beneficial. He managed to make mutually beneficial sound vaguely obscene, which was probably intentional. Gentle beings, Lydia began, settling into her chair with the resigned grace of someone about to referee a fight between three hurricanes. We're here to resolve the Zerion Prime dispute, which has cost countless lives, and has cost nothing. Crixtal slammed his massive fist on the table, causing the Nexari water glasses to rattle. War brings honor, death brings glory. Your soft human concepts of cost mean nothing to true warriors. Belthara's form flickered with what might have been annoyance. Individual Crixtala speaks from primitive emotion centers. We who calculate have determined that continued conflict reduces overall galactic efficiency by 23.4%. This is suboptimal. Suboptimal? Zolkar's laugh sounded like coins falling into a very deep well. My dear collective, this war has been wonderfully profitable. Weapon sales alone have increased my portfolio value by... Perhaps, Lydia interrupted with the diplomatic equivalent of stepping between three charging rhinos, we could discuss the actual mining rights? The next 3 hours were a masterclass in how not to negotiate anything, ever. Each species presented demands that were less opening positions and more elaborate insults disguised as policy. The Vorthak wanted complete military control of Zerion Prime, presumably so they could turn it into a boot camp for especially violent rock. The Zephyrians demanded the planet be strip-mined with mathematical precision, caring nothing for the indigenous microbes that might have feelings about being excavated. The Nexari simply wanted to buy the entire system and charge the other two species rent for existing. Lydia tried 17 different compromise positions. She suggested time-sharing agreements, joint ventures, profit-sharing arrangements, and even offered to flip a three-sided coin if someone could invent one. Each proposal was met with the kind of polite dismissal usually reserved for children who suggested solving world hunger with candy. Human Chen, Crixtal rumbled during a particularly tense moment on day 2. Your species' naivety is amusing. Do you truly believe warriors can be satisfied with schedules and percentages? Individual human Lydia Chen operates from emotion centers rather than logic processes, Valthara added, which was the Zephyrin equivalent of calling someone an idiot. We who think clearly understand that compromise is merely delayed victory for superior minds. Zolkar nodded sagely, his golden teeth glittering. The good ambassador fails to grasp the fundamental nature of business. Someone must win, someone must lose, and someone must pay the transaction fees. By day 3, the talks had devolved into what diplomatic historians would later classify as aggressive posturing with a side of barely contained homicide. The aliens had stopped even pretending to consider human suggestions, instead treating Lydia like a moderately intelligent pet who had learned amusing tricks. The humans, Crixtal announced during a break, speaking about Lydia as if she weren't standing right there, fight like they negotiate, weakly, with much talking and little action. Their neural processing capabilities are severely limited, Valtara agreed. We, who are many, calculate their diplomatic effectiveness at approximately 0.003% of optimal performance. Quite right, Zolkar chimed in, apparently delighted to join the human-bashing party. Though I hear they make adequate servants once properly trained, rather like clever pets. Lydia stood at the observation window, watching ships patrol the neutral zone, while the three species discussed her species like a science project. Marcus appeared beside her, looking like a man who'd been asked to juggle live grenades while riding a unicycle. Ambassador, perhaps we should consider calling in backup? The Geneva Convention doesn't technically apply to space, but... No, Lydia said quietly. No, I don't think backup will be necessary. Day 4 began with what would later be known as the Zerion Ultimatum. All three species had apparently spent the night coordinating their positions, which was rather like watching three hurricanes decide to merge just to be extra destructive. Human, Chen Crixtal declared, his armor gleaming with fresh battle polish. We have decided your mediation services are no longer required. We will settle this matter through honorable combat, as civilized species do." "We who are many concur," Velthara added, her form crackling with collective energy. "Mathematical models indicate that warfare will reach optimal resolution faster than continued discussion with limited intelligent species." "I'm afraid business must proceed," Zolkar said with theatrical regret, "though I'm sure humanity will find other ways to be useful to their betters." The chamber fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems and what sounded suspiciously like alien smugness. Lydia stood at her position, hands folded, looking for all the world like a woman who had just been told her services were no longer required by 3 species who considered her roughly as intelligent as a particularly dim houseplant. And then she laughed. It wasn't a polite diplomatic chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a genuine, deep, thoroughly amused laugh that seemed to come from somewhere around her toes and work its way up through every fiber of her being. The sound echoed in the chamber like a bell, tolling for common sense. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm sorry, that was that was perfect, absolutely perfect." The 3 aliens exchanged glances that managed to convey confusion even across vastly different physiologies. Krikstal's massive head tilted like a predator, trying to figure out why its prey was laughing instead of running. "Human Chen appears to be malfunctioning," Velthara observed. "Should we, who are many, calculate medical intervention probability?" "Perhaps the stress has damaged her limited neural capacity," Zolkar suggested with what might have been concern if you squinted really hard and had terrible eyesight. Lydia stood up. It was a simple motion, really. Rising from a chair, straightening her jacket, placing her hands flat on the table. Nothing dramatic or threatening about it. But somehow, when Lydia Chen stood up in that moment, the entire balance of the room shifted, like a planet changing its orbit. "You know what's funny?" she said conversationally, her voice carrying the kind of calm that usually preceded natural disasters. "You 3 have spent the last 4 days treating me like I'm some sort of primitive diplomatic pet, commenting on human intelligence, human effectiveness, human capabilities, always with that little tone that suggests you're doing us a favor by even acknowledging we exist." She walked around the table slowly, her footsteps the only sound in the chamber. "Krikstal, your empire believes that strength comes from honor and combat prowess. Very impressive. Tell me, how many battles has the Vorthak Empire won in the last decade?" The Supreme Commander's chitinous armor creaked as he shifted uncomfortably. "Victory is not measured merely in—" "7," Lydia continued as if he hadn't spoken. "7 victories out of 43 major engagements. That's a 16% success rate, which my limited human brain calculates as absolutely terrible. But please, tell me more about Vorthak military superiority." She turned to Velthara, whose energy form was flickering with what might have been uncertainty. "And you, Hive Speaker, the collective that thinks with thousands of minds, calculates everything to decimal points, considers emotion a weakness, very logical, very efficient. Except you've been fighting this war for 47 years, and somehow calculated that the optimal solution was to keep fighting indefinitely. A human child with a coin could have resolved this faster." Zolkar's golden complexion had taken on a distinctly greenish tint as Lydia approached his section of the table. "And Trade Prince Zolkar, master of galactic commerce, turner of war into profit, believer in the supreme power of the market, how's that working out? Because from where I'm standing, you've spent more on weapons and mercenaries than the entire disputed mining operation could possibly yield. But I'm sure there's some complex economic principle that explains why losing money is actually profitable." The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the air recyclers sounded like a freight train. Lydia returned to her position but remained standing, her hands still flat on the table. "Here's what you don't understand about humans," she said, her voice taking on an edge that could have cut through Vorthak armor. "We're not diplomatically involved in this conflict because we're weak, or neutral, or harmlessly stupid. We're involved because, for the last 47 years, while you 3 have been blasting each other into constituent atoms, we've been studying you." She reached into her jacket and produced a small device that projected a holographic display above the table. The image showed detailed schematics of Vorthak military installations, complete with tactical assessments and vulnerability analyses. Your impregnable fortress worlds, Kriegstahl. We've mapped every defensive position, catalogued every weapons system, and identified 17 different ways to neutralize your entire command structure without firing a shot. Honor is very inspiring, but it doesn't stop orbital bombardment coordinates. The hologram shifted to show Zephyrian collective nodes, their energy patterns tracked and analyzed down to quantum fluctuations. Your collective consciousness is fascinating, Velthara. Thousands of minds thinking as one, sharing knowledge instantaneously across vast distances. Unfortunately, shared consciousness means shared vulnerabilities. We've developed a harmonic frequency that could disrupt your neural links and reduce your grand collective to individual minds screaming in sudden, terrifying isolation. The display changed again, showing necessary trade routes, financial networks, and what appeared to be documentation of several highly illegal transactions. And Zolkar, your economic empire built on the principle that everything has a price. Wonderful concept. We've calculated the price of crashing your entire currency by simultaneously dumping strategic reserves in 47 different markets. The resulting economic collapse would reduce the mighty Nexari Federation to a collection of very expensive paperweights. The three aliens stared at the holographic displays, with expressions that transcended species barriers in their shared horror. Lydia smiled pleasantly, the expression somehow more terrifying than any weapon. "But wait, there's more," she continued, sounding like a cheerful salesperson offering a deal too good to be true. "While you've been fighting over Zirion Prime, human mining operations have been extracting similar crystalline deposits from 12 different systems. We've been studying the crystal's properties, reverse engineering their applications, and developing synthetic alternatives." The hologram now showed human facilities, their output figures, and what appeared to be a completely functional artificial crystal matrix. "So you see, gentle beings, this entire war has been rather pointless. The resources you're fighting over, we've already got them. The strategic advantages you're seeking, we've neutralized them. The superior positions you're trying to maintain, we've been operating from a higher level all along." Kriegstahl's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Impossible. Human intelligence is limited. Human technology is primitive. You are barely evolved from planetary constraints." "You mind, are we?" Lydia asked mildly. "Kriegstahl, what do you think those primitive human ships in the neutral zone have been doing for the last 4 days?" The Supreme Commander's eyes went wide as the implications hit him like a tactical nuclear revelation. "We who are many do not understand," Velthara said, though her form was now flickering rapidly between states. "Humans lack the processing power for such complex strategic planning." "You're right," Lily agreed. "Individual humans are terrible at processing vast amounts of information simultaneously. Good thing we invented computers. Really, really good computers. Computers that can calculate orbital mechanics, economic models, and psychological profiles, while playing three-dimensional chess and composing poetry. We may not be a collective consciousness, but we've built something better. Artificial intelligence that doesn't share our weaknesses." Zolkar was now the color of old cheese, his golden robe seeming to hang limply around his suddenly diminished frame. "The market data, the financial projections, the trade route analyses, all carefully managed to support whatever conclusions we wanted you to reach," Lydia confirmed. "Amazing how gullible superior intellects can be when they're convinced they're dealing with inferiors." She walked back to her chair but remained standing, her posture relaxed but somehow more commanding than any of the aliens' aggressive displays had been. "So here's where we stand, gentle beings. This war ends today, not because you've reached some mutual understanding or discovered the power of friendship, but because continuing it serves no strategic purpose for humanity. You will sign a peace treaty. You will establish joint mining operations on Zirion Prime under human oversight. You will pay reparations to the 17 neutral worlds your conflict has displaced or damaged." The silence stretched like a rubber band approaching its breaking point. "And if we refuse?" Kriegstahl asked, though his voice had lost most of its bluster. "Then tomorrow morning you'll wake up to find your fleets disabled, your economies crashed, and your governments dealing with sudden, inexplicable communication blackouts," Lydia replied cheerfully. "After which we'll implement the same peace terms, except we'll keep 60% of the mining rights instead of the modest 20% we're currently requesting." "You cannot threaten sovereign species," Zolkar protested, sounding like a man trying to convince himself that gravity was optional. I'm not threatening anyone, Lydia said. I'm simply explaining the consequences of various choices. It's called diplomacy. I thought you'd appreciate the concept, but perhaps it's too primitive for your superior intellects. Veltara's form had stabilized, but the energy patterns were definitely agitated. We, who are many, require time to calculate new probability matrices. You have 15 minutes, Lydia said, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone who had just finished a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. I've got another meeting at 1600 hours with the Andromedan Trade Consortium, and they actually respect punctuality. The next 14 minutes and 37 seconds were filled with the most intense diplomatic discussions the station had ever witnessed, as three galactic powers rapidly recalculated their positions in light of the sudden revelation that they had been outmaneuvered by a species they considered barely evolved. At exactly 14 minutes and 58 seconds, Kriegsstab spoke for all three delegations. We accept human mediation terms. The peace treaty was signed within 2 hours, a document that resolved 47 years of conflict in less time than it usually took to order lunch at a decent restaurant. The aliens departed with expressions that mixed relief, humiliation, and the dawning realization that their understanding of galactic power structures had just been completely revised. Lydia stood at the observation deck again, watching the alien fleets prepare for departure. Marcus appeared beside her, looking like a man who had witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, according to several laws of physics and psychology. The ambassador, he said carefully, was any of that actually true? Lydia smiled, watching the Vorthak dreadnought begin its slow turn away from the station. Marcus, she said, the most important thing you can learn about diplomacy is this: it doesn't matter what's true. What matters is what people believe is true, and what they're willing to risk to find out if they're wrong. The aide considered this wisdom while the Zephyrian sphere began its graceful departure, its crystalline surface reflecting the station's lights like a very expensive, very embarrassed disco ball. So we don't actually have orbital bombardment coordinates for their fortress worlds? Of course not, Lydia replied. But they don't know that, and more importantly, they can't afford to be wrong. The beauty of being underestimated is that people will believe you're capable of almost anything once they realize they've misjudged you. The Nexari vessel was last to leave, its golden hull gleaming as it turned toward the hyperspace jump point. Zolkar had left behind a very expensive gift basket, which was probably the Nexari equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The peace talks ended when she stood up, Marcus mused, quoting what would undoubtedly become the official title of this incident in the diplomatic archives. No, Lydia corrected, her smile taking on a distinctly predatory quality. The peace talks ended when they sat down and assumed they were dealing with children. Everything after that was just cleanup. As the last alien vessel disappeared into hyperspace, the Terran diplomatic station resumed its quiet orbit around Kepler 442b. The Grand Conference Chamber stood empty, its neutral lighting casting soft shadows on the table where three galactic powers had just learned a very expensive lesson about the dangers of underestimating your opposition. Somewhere in the station's communications center, messages were already being dispatched to Earth, carrying news that humanity had just claimed its place at the galactic table, not through military conquest or economic dominance, but through the simple expedient of being vastly more clever than anyone had given them credit for. The universe, it seemed, was about to become a much more interesting place. And in her office, Ambassador Lydia Chen was already reviewing the files for her next assignment, mediating a trade dispute between the Andromedan Consortium and the Centauri Republic. According to the preliminary reports, both sides considered humans to be harmlessly primitive and diplomatically irrelevant. She couldn't help but laugh. Some species, it appeared, never learned.